All right, we come now to chapter 16 of the book, the Vedas, Animal Rights, and Cow Protection, which effectively takes us right back to chapter 1 in terms of our look at the Vedas and some of the things we've talked about. It becomes a nice way for us to sort of begin to piece all of these things together. Well, looking at the question of animals, we go back to our friend Aristotle, and as you recall, Aristotle said that only human beings are moral creatures, because only humans have a rational side of the soul. All right, remember how we talked about Aristotle's view of the soul, where you had the rational and the irrational side. The irrational shared by all of animal kind, but only the rational side belonged to human beings. And it was that rational capacity to be able to weigh options, make decisions, learn from our mistakes, to override our animal instincts. All of that stuff is what made us human beings. It's what made us moral creatures. And so by Aristotle's understanding, only human beings are moral creatures, because we are the only ones who have that rational side of the soul. Aristotle, of course, set a huge precedent which is going to carry down throughout the ages for us. Thomas Aquinas, who we looked at in chapter 7 of the book, made the argument that animals have no souls at all. It's not just that they don't have the rational side of the soul, but he argued that they have no souls whatsoever. As a result, animals will not be saved, they will not go to heaven. Animals simply are here, they live for a time, they serve a purpose, and they die. And that's it. Only human beings have that eternal soul that allows them to live on. The view that Aquinas adopted and put forward becomes the official view of the Catholic Church. The French philosopher René Descartes, who we didn't really talk about much in here, we mentioned him a little bit in connection with Hume, but he made the argument that animals have no feelings or emotions whatsoever, that they react simply like machinery. And so for Descartes, animals were automatons. They were work machines, and they served no other purpose than that. It didn't really matter what we did to them or how we treated them, because they had no feelings, they had no emotions, they didn't feel pain and misery in the way that human beings did, they didn't feel love in the way that human beings did, and so on. And so the Western world has clearly shown us throughout the last 2,000 years at least that animals are simply creatures that are put here for our usage, for our purpose, that they have no rights of their own, that they do not feel or think or reason or anything else in the way that human beings do, and so we should simply use them and exploit them at will. The Eastern view is a little bit different, of course, but I wanted to point out to you that both in the East and the West, there is this connection between reason and morality, between the idea of something being rational and something being moral. That's a view that Aristotle established in the West, and we saw it in those last three figures that I showed to you, right? That it's only because the animals lack that reasoning capacity that they lack the moral capacity. Well, in the Eastern world, there's also the idea of reason equating to morality. And we see it, though, to be found within the animal kingdom. Within the story of the Ramayana, there's the story of Vali and Sugriv. Vali and Sugriv are monkeys, and the one is the rightful ruler of the monkeys, the other, his cousin, has usurped his power. Well, Rama is going to help the rightful ruler regain his control, regain his position. But Vali is going to say, he was the one who had usurped the power, he's going to say at the end, but how can you hold me accountable? I'm only a monkey, right? And he tries to fall back upon his status as a mere animal. But Ram says to him, if you know about morality, you have a duty to obey it. If you can make such an argument is to say, look, I can't be held accountable for my actions because I'm only an animal. If you're intelligent enough to make that argument, you're intelligent enough to know the difference between right and wrong. And if you know the difference between right and wrong, if you know what is morally correct, then you have an obligation, you have a duty to obey it. And so in the Eastern world, we do see a sense in which animals are afforded that sense of reason. And that means that animals do have the right to be treated considerably better than what they were traditionally in the Western world. In the late 60s and beyond, the Australian philosopher Peter Singer began a movement on animal rights, and it began with the publication of a very important book in 1970 called Animal Liberation. And what Singer argues is that while not the same as humans, animals do have thought, they have reason, they have decision, they have understanding. Animals have feelings and emotions, and so yes, animals are moral creatures. They have a right to be treated with respect and dignity. We should not simply use and abuse them for our own purposes. Animals may not have the same type of mind that a human does. It may not reason in the same way, but an animal is capable of learning. An animal is capable of learning from its mistakes. An animal is capable of thought and reason, at least to an extent. And there's no doubt that animals have feelings and emotion. We can see the love that is displayed between a parent and a child in the animal kingdom. We can see the love that a pet shows towards its caregiver. We can hear the whimpering and the cries when an animal is hurt. It seems unfathomable to claim that animals don't feel or have any emotion. And so all of these things the animal does have, Singer says. And so we have a duty, an obligation to treat those animals with respect and dignity, to treat them as members of the moral community. Now that view, when it first came out, was very controversial. It was perceived as left-wing fringe ideology. But over the last 50 years, it has come more and more central, and we have more and more people now who are saying that, yes, animals do deserve basic rights, they do deserve humane treatment, and so forth. So, what Singer says seems obvious, so why do we deny it? Well, traditionally, the Western world has denied that animals are moral beings with reason or emotion, because it simply makes it easier to exploit them. Human beings want to use the animals. They want to eat them, they want to overwork them, they want to abuse them, and they don't want to have to think about the way that they're treating the animals. Let's face it, a lot of times throughout our history, people weren't overly concerned with how they treated human beings. And so, to treat animals in this way seems to be quite easy for them. I think it's interesting to note that a lot of the same arguments that were used for the misuse of animals were also used for the misuse of slaves. People used to argue that slaves didn't think or reason in the way that human beings did, that slaves didn't feel pain in the way that human beings did. And so these same types of arguments that people like Descartes were making towards animals, others were making towards human slaves. Saying, well, these people are, these creatures are different. So if we now are enlightened enough to realize that our mistreatment of those slaves was wrong, shouldn't we also be enlightened enough to know that our mistreatment of those animals is wrong? One of the major issues, of course, is the question of food, using animals for food, for meat consumption. And so I thought we'd look at this in a few different ways, which you can see this also in the text. But if we look at the scriptures, in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 9, verse 26, Krishna says, "If one offers me with love and devotion a leaf, a flower, a fruit, a water, I will accept it. Now, what we find here is that in the Vedic culture, food should be prepared not for our own benefit or our own consumption. It should be prepared as an offering being offered up to Krishna. And so we want to prepare for him the things that he likes, the things that he desires. And so what does he ask for? He asks for very simple foods, very simple vegetarian fare. Nowhere does he ever ask for the destruction of animals. And so as human beings now, in preparation of our own food for consumption, we want to model ourselves after what Krishna has established, and therefore to take on a vegetarian affair rather than one of meat consumption. In addition, of course, we have to recognize, too, that under the Vedic culture, because of the policies of reincarnation, that it is perfectly possible that a person could come back as an animal or an animal could come back as a person. And, we leave ourselves wondering, would you really want to eat your relative? When we look to the Western world, we can look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 29. Right in the very beginning, as God is creating the universe, he says, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And so we recognize that in that opening scene of Genesis, that God is telling us that we are designed, we are created to be vegetarian. There's no mention here of giving animals to the people. It is giving over vegetarian matter to the people for consumption. Now, granted, after the flood, there are other statements that are made, and you get kosher laws and certain meats that could be consumed and can't. But in the very beginning, in the Garden of Eden, in our state of perfection, we were meant to live a vegetarian lifestyle according to the book of Genesis. Now that's the religious view, which seems to support this idea, but we also have the scientific view. The scientific view tells us that human beings have a lot more in common with herbivores than they do with carnivores. First of all, carnivores, we know, have sharp teeth for ripping through flesh. Humans and herbivores do not. Over the course of time, through evolution, we've developed a couple of sharper teeth in the front, canines, that have come because we've chosen to consume flesh. But the teeth themselves are not like that of a carnivore, which is intended for ripping and tearing. We have a very different situation. Secondly, carnivores have a very strong stomach acid to help meat dissolve. Humans and herbivores have a stomach acid that's 20 times weaker. You look at the traditional carnivore, the tiger, the lion, they have an incredibly strong stomach acid, which is going to make that meat dissolve very, very, very quickly. Whereas the human, because our stomach acid is so much weaker, it's going to sit in there for a longer period of time. And that's going to produce health problems. And thirdly, carnivore's intestines is 3 times the length of its body. Humans and herbivores, it's 12 times the body length. So when something passes through the digestive tract of a carnivore, it's going to be in and out very, very quickly. It's not going to sit around in the way that it does with human beings or herbivores. And this becomes important because, as you probably know, any type of meat has parasites that live within it. It also has the potential for rotting, which creates a lot of problems there as well. So by getting the food through more rapidly, it keeps that carnivore safe, whereas we end up having a lot of health problems because, and the more red meat particularly that we eat, the more health problems we have because of these factors. So scientifically, it seems that we are designed more to be a herbivore than a carnivore. So why do Westerners eat meat? Well, there's the historical reason. Meat was a delicacy reserved for the wealthy. To consume it established status. Secondly, the economic reason. It's big business. It's published and subsidized by the industry, by the government. And of course, there's the selfish reason. It tastes good. But of course, we have to ask ourselves whether any of that really, but especially the third one, is a good reason. Think about it, if you were, let's say there were an alien race who came to this planet and discovered that they enjoyed the taste of human flesh. To those aliens, we would seem just as animal-like as the animals seem to us. They would probably not think much about raising us to slaughter and consume. But would we stand by and say this is okay? No, I don't think we would. I don't think we would allow ourselves to be consumed simply because some alien race thinks we taste good. It doesn't make for a good moral argument. But in any event, these are the basic reasons why human beings, in the West at least, have supported this idea. It gives them a position of power within society. It makes a lot of money, and we simply have the desire for the flavors. So what is the alternative if we don't consume meat? Well, there is one solution that will show respect to the animals as a moral creature and bring humans and animals alike greater prosperity and happiness. And this is what we now call cow protection. In your book, I wanted to bring your attention here, I'm almost out of time again, but bring your attention to page 253. More than half of the world's grain is consumed by animals that are later slaughtered for meat. Meat production is a very insufficient process. It takes 16 pounds of grain and soybeans to produce 1 pound of feedlot beef. If people were to subsist on grains and other vegetarian foods alone, it would put far less strain on the Earth's agricultural lands. About 20 vegetarians can be fed from the land it takes to feed one meat eater. During the process of converting grain to meat, 90% of the protein, 99% of the carbohydrates, 100% of the dietary fiber is lost. 80% of the corn raised in the U.S. is fed to livestock, as well as 95% of the oats. Altogether, 56% of all agricultural land in the United States is used for beef production. If all the soybeans and grain fed yearly to U.S. livestock were set aside for human consumption, it would feed 1.3 billion people. In his book, Proteins, Their Chemistry and Politics, Dr. Aaron Ashtool says, in terms of calorie units per acre, a diet of grains, vegetables, and beans will support 20 times more people than a diet of meat. If the Earth's arable land were used primarily for the production of vegetarian foods, the planet could easily support a population of 20 billion and more. And so a lot of people might question whether or not it would be dangerous to move, given our overpopulation. But the fact is that if we switch to a vegetarian diet, we would actually have a healthier population and we would have a better sustained population without the fear of loss of food, without the fear of starvation. Cow protection is the ultimate answer.